Are those supposed to be real? The words sliced through the courtroom's heavy silence like a blade through silk. Judge Thornfield's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man who had never truly suffered, never truly served. His expensive Italian suit probably cost more than the weathered motorcycle Frank Thompson had ridden to court that morning. The judge leaned forward across his mahogany bench, a predatory smile creeping across his lips as he stared down at the elderly man standing before him. Frank Thompson, 84 years old, stood motionless as a statue. Decades of military discipline had carved perfect posture into his very bones, a testament to training forged in places this pampered judge couldn't even imagine. He wore a simple, faded denim jacket that had weathered countless storms and seasons. Pinned carefully to his left breast, positioned directly over his heart, were 3 neat rows of colorful ribbons and 1 distinctive star-shaped medal suspended from a pale blue ribbon. These medals had become the judge's source of twisted entertainment. "Your Honor," interrupted Emma Rodriguez, Frank's young public defender, her voice steady but strained. "My client's military service has absolutely no relevance to this traffic violation." Judge Thornfield dismissed her with a wave of his manicured hand, never bothering to acknowledge her presence. His cold eyes remained locked on Frank like a hawk studying wounded prey. "Oh, I'm certain it doesn't," the judge replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I'm simply curious. That's quite an impressive collection for someone who apparently can't remember basic speed limits on county roads." He paused dramatically, savoring the moment. "Let me take a wild guess. You picked those up at some military surplus store, didn't you? A little costume jewelry to impress your buddies down at the Veterans Hall?" A collective shift rippled through the small gallery. Most spectators, waiting for their own minor infractions to be called, stared in uncomfortable silence. A few snickers escaped from the back rows, but most faces showed a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. Frank Thompson remained absolutely still, his clear gray eyes, sharp as a winter morning, focused on the state flag hanging behind the judge's chair. He showed no anger, no insult, no reaction whatsoever. He seemed to have transported himself somewhere else entirely, to a place of unshakable inner peace. "I ask you a direct question, sir," Judge Thornfield pressed, his voice rising with irritation. He relished these moments, the intoxicating power of his position, the ability to systematically tear a person apart under the pretense of judicial authority. "Are you going to answer me, or are you as deaf as you are?" "Decorated." Emma Rodriguez shot to her feet, her cheeks flushing with righteous anger. "Your Honor, this behavior is completely inappropriate. Mr. Thompson is a veteran and deserves our respect, not ridicule. Respect is earned, Counselor." Judge Thornfield snapped back, his voice cracking like a whip. "Parading around with a chest full of tin trinkets doesn't automatically earn respect in my courtroom." He leaned back in his oversized leather chair, a caricature of smug authority. "Now, Mr. Thompson, for the final time, where exactly did you acquire those medals?" Frank's gaze slowly descended from the flag to meet the judge's stare. When he spoke, his voice emerged quiet but carried surprising weight, like river stones worn smooth by decades of current. "They were given to me." The simple honesty of his answer seemed to infuriate the judge even further. It offered no ammunition for his verbal assault, no weakness to exploit. "Given to you by whom?" Thornfield sneered. "The costume department manager?" Judge Thornfield settled back into his chair with the satisfaction of a bully who had found his mark. "Let me be crystal clear about something. I am absolutely tired of men from your generation thinking that some uniform they wore 50 years ago grants them a permanent free pass. You ran a stop sign. You were clocked at 20 miles over the posted limit. And now you stand in my courtroom wearing that ridiculous jacket like it's some kind of protective shield." Each word was a calculated strike, designed to humiliate and destroy. "I find it personally insulting to the genuine heroes who actually serve this country." Emma felt tension coiling in her body like a spring ready to snap. She glanced at her client, studying Frank's weathered hands, gnarled with age and marked with liver spots, resting calmly on the defense table. He didn't fidget. He didn't flinch. He simply stood there, absorbing the judge's venom without the slightest flicker of reaction. "Remove the jacket," Judge Thornfield commanded suddenly. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. This had transcended a simple traffic hearing. It had become a public stripping of human dignity. "Your Honor, you cannot be serious," Emma pleaded, her voice trembling with barely controlled outrage. "I am perfectly serious, Counselor. This is my courtroom, and the defendant will show proper respect. That display is a distraction and a mockery. Remove it, Mr. Thompson, or I will hold you in contempt of court. The bailiff, a burly man who had witnessed countless courtroom dramas, took a hesitant step forward. His eyes met Frank's, and for a moment, he looked genuinely uncertain, almost apologetic. Frank did not move. He did not acknowledge the bailiff or the judge. Instead, he looked down at the medals on his own chest, his gaze lingering for just a fraction of a second on the one hanging from the blue ribbon. He seemed to be listening to some distant echo, a sound no one else in the room could possibly hear. His silence was his answer, a profound and unyielding refusal. Fine. The judge spat, his face turning a blotchy crimson. Bailiff, add a charge of contempt of court and a $500 fine. Perhaps that will capture his attention. Judge Thornfield's eyes narrowed on the most prominent medal, the one that hung slightly separated from the others. He pointed a fat finger at it with theatrical disgust. Especially that one, the absolute gall to wear a replica of the Medal of Honor. Do you have any concept of what that represents, old man? The blood and sacrifice it symbolizes? You wearing that fraudulent decoration is a slap in the face to every person who ever served honorably. As Judge Thornfield spoke his condemning words, the sterile, wood-paneled courtroom began to dissolve around Frank Thompson like morning mist. The judge's mocking voice faded into a different kind of roar, not the hostility of a crowd, but the thunderous chop of helicopter rotors and the screams of wounded men. The air, thick with the smell of floor polish and stale coffee, was suddenly choked with the metallic tang of fresh blood and the acrid smoke of gunpowder. For one fleeting moment, he wasn't standing on worn courthouse linoleum. He was back in the sucking mud of a rice paddy outside Hugh City. He wasn't looking at a judge's sneering face, but into the terrified, wide eyes of a young private from Ohio named Miller, whose leg had been shredded by enemy machine gun fire. The blue of the medal's ribbon was the impossible, brilliant blue of the sky he had glimpsed through the jungle canopy just before he scrambled from the relative safety of a bomb crater. Frank could feel the weight of Miller on his back, the hot, wet soak of blood through his combat fatigues, the deafening chatter of enemy guns stitching a deadly line in the mud just inches from his head. He remembered the burning in his lungs, the singular, desperate thought, not of living or dying, but of getting that boy to the medical evacuation helicopter. The medal wasn't a piece of tin. It was the weight of another man's life carried on his shoulders. The memory vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Frank back in the silent, tense courtroom. He blinked slowly, his composure completely unbroken. Only his breathing had changed, becoming just a fraction deeper, slightly more measured. Emma Rodriguez watched this entire exchange, her heart pounding with helpless fury. She witnessed the judge's cruelty, the crowd's cowardly silence, and Frank's incredible, almost supernatural composure. She knew with bone-deep certainty that she was witnessing a terrible injustice. This judge wasn't just wrong. He was desecrating something sacred. She looked down at her case file. Frank Thompson. A few prior speeding tickets scattered over the last 20 years. Nothing else significant. His address, social security number, date of birth. In the intake forms box marked military service, Frank had simply written yes. He hadn't specified a branch, rank, or single honor. The humility of it, especially in the face of this public humiliation, was absolutely staggering. A desperate idea sparked in her mind, a wild, long-shot gamble. While Judge Thornfield continued pontificating to the court reporter, adding his self-righteous justifications to the official record, Emma leaned close to Frank. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered urgently, "is there anyone I can contact from your old unit?" Frank turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze for the first time. There was no fear in his eyes, only a deep, profound weariness that seemed to carry the weight of decades. He gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "It was a long time ago, miss. Most of them are gone now. There has to be someone," she insisted, refusing to abandon hope. She noticed a small, barely visible pin on his jacket collar, a simple crest she didn't recognize. "Let me step out for just a moment. I need to retrieve a file from my office." The judge waved her away without even looking. "Do whatever you want, counselor. Your client isn't going anywhere." Emma practically sprinted from the courtroom, her heels clicking frantically against the polished marble floor. She ducked into an empty alcove in the hallway, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. She didn't actually have any file to retrieve. She had the pin. She quickly typed a description into her search engine. U.S. Army crest sword behind Castle Tower. The results flooded her screen immediately. First Special Forces Group. The Green Berets. Her breath caught in her throat. This was something entirely different. She scrolled desperately through search results, looking for any contact, a public affairs office, a veterans liaison, anything at all. She found a general number for Fort Lewis, the group's headquarters. It was a wild gamble, a shot fired into complete darkness. A bored-sounding specialist answered. Fort Lewis Public Affairs. My name is Emma Rodriguez, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. I'm a public defender in Northwood County. I have a client here, a veteran. He's in serious trouble. Ma'am, we cannot get involved in civilian legal matters, the specialist replied, his voice flat with practiced disinterest. I understand completely, but his name is Frank Thompson. He's being held in contempt of court because the judge refuses to believe his medals are authentic. Ma'am, I cannot. He's wearing a first group pin, she blurted out, playing her final desperate card. Please, his name is Frank Thompson. There was a pause on the other end of the line. The bored tone vanished instantly, replaced by sharp, focused silence. Spell that last name for me. T-H-O-M-P-S-O. She stammered. First name Frank. She heard the sound of furious typing, then a sharp intake of breath. The voice that returned was completely transformed, crisp, urgent, and filled with an energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. Ma'am, what courtroom are you in? Courtroom C, Northwood County Courthouse. Do not let your client leave. Do not let them take him anywhere. We are on our way. The line went dead. The phone call ended in Washington State, but the shockwave it created traveled at light speed. The specialist who took Emma's call didn't hesitate for a single second. He bypassed 3 levels of his own command structure, patching the call directly to the office of the base's commanding officer, AD, a battle-hardened colonel with 30 years of combat experience. The colonel listened intently, his knuckles turning bone white as he gripped his desk. The moment he heard the name Frank Thompson, he rose from his chair like a man possessed. Hold the line, he commanded, and without another word, he strode from his office down the hall to a larger, more opulent suite of rooms. He didn't even bother to knock. Inside, General David Sterling was reviewing quarterly logistics reports. He was a man seemingly carved from granite and steel, with 3 silver stars gleaming on his shoulders and a gaze that could strip paint from walls. He looked up, annoyed at the intrusion. Sir, the colonel said, breathing heavily, we have a code Nightingale. The general's eyes sharpened instantly. Code Nightingale was an unofficial, unwritten protocol reserved for a handful of living legends, men whose service was so extraordinary that the institution itself was honor-bound to protect them regardless of circumstances. It had not been activated in over a decade. Who? The general asked, his voice a low rumble. Sergeant Major Frank Thompson, sir. General Sterling was out of his chair before the colonel finished the sentence. Logistics reports scattered across his desk, completely forgotten. A look of disbelief, followed by thunderous anger, passed across his weathered face. Where is he? Northwood County Courthouse, sir. A local judge is holding him in contempt, accusing him of wearing fake medals. The colonel paused, his voice filling with disgust. Specifically, the Medal of Honor. The general's jaw tightened until a muscle bunched in his cheek. He moved with speed and purpose that defied his age. He pointed directly at the colonel. Get me a helicopter to the nearest airfield and a car waiting on arrival. Full honor guard escort, dress uniforms. I want to be there in under 1 hour. He turned to his aide, who was already scrambling to his feet. Get me everything on Judge Thornfield of Northwood County. I want to know where he attended school, who he owes favors to, and what he ate for breakfast. To the colonel, he gave one final, chilling order. And get the Secretary of the Army on the line immediately. Tell him a national treasure is being publicly humiliated by a man who doesn't deserve to shine his boots. Back in courtroom C, the air had grown thick and stagnant with Judge Thornfield's self-satisfaction. He had made his point thoroughly. He had intimidated the young public defender and was now preparing to deliver his final, crushing blow to the silent old man before him. Emma had returned to the defense table, her face pale but her eyes holding a new, defiant spark that the judge chose to completely ignore. Given your refusal to comply with a direct order from this court, Judge Thornfield began, savoring each syllable, and your clear state of delusion regarding your alleged past exploits, I am not only holding you in contempt, but I am also deeply concerned about your mental fitness. He let that poison hang in the air like a toxic cloud. Therefore, I am ordering a mandatory 72-hour psychiatric evaluation. The bailiff will remand you into custody of the county sheriff's department, who will transport you to the state hospital for comprehensive assessment. This was the ultimate degradation, not just a fine, not merely jail time, but a public declaration that Frank Thompson was mentally unstable, that his entire life, his service, his honor, were nothing more than the delusions of a broken mind. The gavel was in his hand. He raised it high, the final punctuation mark on his petty tyranny. He never got the chance to bring it down. A muffled commotion from the hallway outside suddenly interrupted the proceedings. The heavy oak doors to the courtroom burst open, swinging inward with such tremendous force that they banged against the walls like thunder. Two soldiers, ramrods straight in immaculate army dress blue uniforms, entered the room. They moved with synchronized, powerful grace, one taking position to the left of the entrance, the other to the right. They stood at perfect parade rest, their faces completely impassive, their eyes fixed straight ahead like sentries guarding a tomb. The courtroom fell into stunned, absolute silence. Judge Thornfield froze mid-motion, his gavel still held aloft, his mouth slightly agape in shock. Then a third man entered. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark green service uniform perfectly pressed, the jacket glittering with an impressive array of medals and ribbons. 3 silver stars gleamed brilliantly on each of his shoulders. This was General David Sterling. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't acknowledge the gallery. His eyes, sharp and intense as laser beams, scanned the room methodically until they found their target. He began walking down the central aisle, his polished boots making sounds like measured, deliberate heartbeats on the tiled floor. Click, click. Each step was an indictment. Each step shifted the balance of power in the room completely. The air crackled with an authority that made the judge's bluster seem like a child's tantrum. General Sterling stopped directly in front of the defense table, less than 2 feet from Frank Thompson. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. A universe of shared understanding passed between them in that silent gaze. The general's hard face softened with profound respect and something approaching reverence. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the entire courtroom, General David Sterling snapped to the sharpest, most precise position of attention of his entire career. His right hand came up in a salute so crisp and perfect it seemed to cut the very air. His gloved fingers touched the brim of his service cap. His arm formed a rigid line of absolute respect. Sergeant Major Thompson. The general's voice boomed clear and strong, filling every corner of the silent room. It is an honor to be in your presence, sir. He held the salute perfectly, his eyes locked on Frank's. Slowly, as if awakening from a long dream, Frank Thompson straightened his shoulders. The weariness seemed to fall away from him like an old coat, replaced by an echo of the soldier he had once been. He brought his own weathered hand up, his movement stiff with age but no less precise, and returned the salute with dignity. Judge Thornfield finally found his voice, sputtering with confusion and outrage. What is the meaning of this? Who are you? I am in the middle of a judicial proceeding. General Sterling slowly lowered his hand, but his eyes never left Frank's face. Only after Frank had lowered his own hand did the general turn his head. He pinned Judge Thornfield with a gaze so cold and furious it seemed to drop the room's temperature by 20 degrees. The meaning, Your Honor, the general said, his voice dangerously quiet, is that you are in the presence of a hero of the Republic, and you are about to learn a lesson in respect. He took a deliberate step toward the bench, pulling a folded piece of paper from his inner pocket. You questioned this man's medals. Allow me to enlighten you. He began to read, his voice resonating with pride and barely contained anger. Sergeant Major Frank Thompson, enlisted United States Army, 1958, served with distinction for 30 years, 3 tours in Vietnam. Member of the 5th Special Forces Group, Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. He paused, letting the weight of that legendary unit's name settle over the room like a blanket. Awards and decorations include the Bronze Star with V for Valor, 3 awards, the Silver Star, 2 awards, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Purple Heart, 4 awards, With each medal named, a new wave of shock rippled through the gallery. People were sitting up straighter, their faces showing mixtures of awe and shame. A local reporter in the back was scribbling frantically in his notepad. "And this one," the general continued, his voice dropping as he looked directly at the medal hanging from the blue ribbon. "This gaudy piece of tin you so casually dismissed. This is the Medal of Honor, awarded to then Staff Sergeant Thompson for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty." The silence was deafening. On February 4th, 1968, near the city of Hue, Sergeant Thompson, with complete disregard for his own safety, single-handedly charged 2 enemy machine gun nests, eliminating them both, and proceeded to carry 3 wounded comrades across 200 meters of open, fire-swept terrain to a medical evacuation point. He then returned to the fight. The general folded the paper with sharp, deliberate movements. He stared directly at the judge. "This man's jacket holds more honor than this entire courthouse, yourself included. He is not a defendant. He is a national treasure, and you, in your arrogance, saw fit to humiliate him." Judge Thornfield's face had transformed from red to a pasty, sickly white. He looked small and powerless behind his large, imposing bench. He opened his mouth, but no words emerged. For the first time in his professional life, he was utterly and completely silenced. The gavel lay forgotten on his desk like a discarded toy. The general turned back to Frank. "Sergeant Major, on behalf of the United States Army and a grateful nation, I apologize for the indignity you have been subjected to today." He then turned his icy gaze back to the judge, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "As for you, Your Honor, you seem to have a serious problem with veterans. I would strongly suggest you rectify that immediately. I have already been on the phone with your state's governor as well as the head of the Judicial Conduct Commission. They are very, very interested in today's transcript. I imagine your career of public service is about to come to a rather abrupt end." The finality in his voice was absolute. He hadn't just won an argument. He had dismantled the judge's entire world in less than 5 minutes. It was Frank who broke the heavy silence that followed. He placed a gentle hand on the general's arm. "David," he said, his voice soft but crystal clear. "He's a man who made a mistake, a bad one, but he just didn't know." He looked up at the judge, not with anger or triumph, but with surprising gentleness. "The medals aren't the point, son," he said, his voice carrying the quiet wisdom of someone who had witnessed both the best and worst of humanity. "They're just reminders. Respect isn't something you demand with a gavel. It's something you give freely to the person standing in front of you, whether they're a general or a janitor. That's the only lesson there is." As Frank spoke of giving respect freely, the image of the courtroom dissolved one final time. He was no longer an elderly man in a courthouse, but a young soldier in a sweltering jungle, his uniform torn and stained with sweat and blood. He was kneeling beside a captured enemy soldier, no older than a boy, whose eyes were wide with terror. Frank's own canteen was nearly empty, but he unscrewed the cap without hesitation and held it to the boy's lips, giving him precious water. It was a small act of grace in a world of horror, a quiet recognition of shared humanity that transcended uniforms and battle lines. The honor wasn't in the fighting, it was in remembering you were human. The aftermath of that day in Courtroom C was swift and decisive. The story, broken by the local reporter and quickly picked up by national news outlets, went viral within hours. The image of General Sterling saluting the unassuming elderly veteran became a symbol of honor and accountability. Judge Thornfield was suspended immediately. After a formal investigation by the State Judicial Commission, he was forced into early, disgraceful retirement. In response to public outcry, the state legislature passed new legislation, unofficially called Thompson's Law, mandating cultural competency and sensitivity training regarding military veterans for all public officials. General Sterling ensured that Frank's traffic ticket was not just dismissed, but formally expunged with a written apology from the state. Frank wanted none of the attention. He returned to his quiet life, fixing his motorcycle in his garage and meeting his friends for coffee on Tuesday mornings. About a month later, Frank was sitting in his usual booth at a small local diner. The bell over the door chimed, and a man walked in, looking hesitant and out of place in a simple polo shirt and khakis. It was Thornfield. He looked older, smaller, stripped of his judicial robes and arrogance. He saw Frank and walked slowly over to the table. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, Can I sit down?" Frank simply gestured to the seat across from him. Thornfield sat, his hands fidgeting nervously on the table. "I wanted to apologize," he said, unable to meet Frank's eyes. "What I did, what I said, there's no excuse for it. I was arrogant. I was cruel. And I was wrong. I'm sorry." Frank took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked at the man across from him, a person broken by his own pride. He saw no reason for any additional punishment. "I hear you're not on the bench anymore," Frank said, his tone neutral. "No," Thornfield admitted quietly. "I'm not." "Good," Frank said. For a second, Thornfield flinched. A man shouldn't have a job he doesn't have the heart for. He pushed a menu across the table. "The coffee's good here." It was an offer of peace, a simple, graceful act of forgiveness. Thornfield looked up, finally meeting Frank's gaze, and for the first time, he saw not a defendant or an old man, but simply a person worthy of respect. He nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Stories like Frank Thompson's remind us that heroes walk among us every day, often unseen and unrecognized. If you believe in honoring their quiet valor, please share this story with others who need to hear it.